Grief is supposed to be a wave, they say. It crashes over you, pulls you under, and leaves you gasping on the shore of a new and terrible reality. For me, it had been a pane of thick, cold glass. It separated me from the world, muffling the sounds of sympathy and turning the concerned faces of friends into distorted masks. I sat in the front pew of St. Jude's Episcopal Church, a perfect porcelain doll of a widow, 72 years of composure holding me upright. My black dress was immaculate, my silver hair pinned in a neat chignon. I was Eleanor Vance, wife of the late Richard Vance, and I was playing my part. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies and old wood, a cloying sweetness that clung to the back of my throat. Outside, the main sky was a sheet of brushed steel, threatening a rain it was too weary to release. Inside, the pews were filled with the town's finest. The mayor was here, the bank president, the families my husband had advised for generations. Richard had been a pillar of our small community of Kennebunkport, solid and dependable as the granite coastline. His death, a sudden, brutal accident during a solo sail, had sent a tremor through us all. A rogue wave, the Coast Guard had said. His beloved yacht, the Albatross, found splintered against the rocks. His body, recovered days later, was difficult. Identification had been confirmed through dental records. A clean, tragic end. I stared at the mahogany casket, closed and gleaming under the soft church lights. It felt impossibly small to contain a man as large as Richard, a man whose presence had filled every room, every moment of my life for 50 years. The glass between me and the world held firm. I felt nothing but a distant, hollow ache. Then my son, Leo, stepped up to the pulpit. He looked so much like Richard, but a softer, less defined version. The same broad shoulders, but they stooped with a weight that wasn't just grief. The same dark hair, but his was thinning at the crown. He adjusted the microphone, the rustle of his notes echoing in the solemn silence. My father, Richard Vance, he began, his voice thick with practiced emotion, was a man of principle. A man who charted his own course, both on the sea and in life. He spoke of my husband's integrity, his quiet generosity, his love for the ocean. The words were beautiful, the kind of eulogy that would be quoted in the local paper. But they felt like a script, learned and recited. As Leo spoke, my hand, resting on the leather clutch in my lap, felt a faint vibration. I frowned. My phone. I'd forgotten to turn it off. How careless. I discreetly unclasped the purse, intending to silence the device. But the screen was already lit, displaying a new message from an unknown number. My first thought was of a misdirected condolence. My finger hovered over the dismiss button. Curiosity, a flicker of life in the frozen landscape of my grief, made me tap the screen instead. The message was short. 6 words and an initial that made my heart stop. I'm still alive. Trust no one. My breath hitched. My knuckles went white around the phone. It had to be a mistake. A sick, cruel prank. Who would do such a thing? I read the words again, my mind refusing to process them. They were just letters on a screen, meaningless pixels. But then came the second line. Especially him. R. My gaze snapped up from the phone, a magnetic pull drawing my eyes to the pulpit. To Leo. It happened in an instant, a crack in the fabric of time. As if he felt my stare, Leo's voice faltered. He stumbled over the word legacy. His eyes, which had been scanning the sympathetic faces in the crowd, darted around the church until they found mine. For a fraction of a second, we were the only 2 people in the room. I saw it. Not grief. Not sadness. I saw a flash of pure, unadulterated panic in my son's eyes. He looked like a startled animal caught in the beam of a hunter's light. His Adam's apple bobbed. He reached up with a trembling hand and tugged at the knot of his silk tie, as if it were a noose tightening around his neck. He quickly looked back down at his notes, clearing his throat. My father taught me everything I know. The pane of glass between me and the world didn't just crack. It exploded. A million razor-sharp shards of sound and color rushed in. The scent of lilies was suddenly suffocating. The muffled sobs from the back pew became a wail. The face of the mayor was a mask of pity I wanted to rip away. The polished casket at the front of the church was no longer a vessel of sorrow, but a monument to a lie. Trust no one. Especially him. The R could only mean one person. Richard. Leo finished his speech to a chorus of sniffles and murmurs of so moving. He walked back to the pew and sat beside me, placing a hand on my arm. It was meant to be comforting. It felt like the touch of a scorpion. His skin was clammy. "Are you all right, Mom?" he whispered, his breath smelling faintly of mints used to cover the scent of something else. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, my eyes fixed on the casket. My mind was a maelstrom. If Richard was alive, who was in that box? And why was my own son so terrified? The message wasn't a prank. The fear in Leo's eyes was real. It was the key that unlocked a door to a room I never knew existed in my own home, in my own life. The service ended. People shuffled past, murmuring their condolences. He was a good man, Eleanor. He'll be missed. If there's anything you need. I smiled and nodded, a perfect automaton of grief. But inside, I was no longer mourning a death. I was facing something far worse. A betrayal. They were lowering a box of polished wood and lies into the ground, and I, Eleanor Vance, was suddenly very much afraid that I had buried the wrong man. The drive home from the cemetery was a silent one. Leo handled my Lincoln Town car with an uncharacteristic, jerky nervousness, his knuckles white on the leather steering wheel. I watched the familiar landscape of coastal Maine slide by the window, the stoic pines, the gray shingles of colonial houses, the brief, brilliant flashes of the Atlantic. It was a scenery I had loved, a landscape of permanence. Now it all felt like a painted backdrop for a play I no longer understood. When we pulled into the driveway of our home, my home, now, the last of the well-meaning neighbors were departing, leaving foil-covered dishes on the porch steps like offerings at a shrine. "I'll get those, Mom," Leo said, rushing to open my door. "You go on inside. You need to rest." His solicitude was a thick, suffocating blanket. Inside, the house was unnervingly quiet. For 50 years, it had been filled with Richard's presence, the sound of the financial news droning from the television, the scent of his aftershave, the solid, reassuring thud of his footsteps on the hardwood floors. Now, the silence was an entity in itself, a ghost that had taken up residence in every corner. Leo placed the casseroles on the kitchen counter and began fussing, turning on lamps against the encroaching dusk, checking the thermostat. "Can I get you some tea? Or maybe something stronger?" "I'm fine, Leo. Just tired." Of course," he said, avoiding my eyes. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his father's it caused a pang in my chest, a mix of nostalgia and fresh, cold suspicion. "Listen, Mom, there's going to be a lot of paperwork. Insurance, the estate, Dad's business accounts. It can be overwhelming. I want you to know you don't have to worry about a thing. I'll handle all of it." There it was. An offer wrapped in the guise of love, but it felt like a cage being lowered over me. Trust no one. Especially him. The words from the text message echoed in the silent house. I summoned a weak, weary smile. It was a mask I had perfected over decades, the gentle matriarch who never made a fuss. "That's very sweet of you, dear. But I think I'll be all right. Your father always said I had a better head for figures than he did." A flicker of something, annoyance? Panic crossed his face before he smoothed it over. "I'm sure he did. But this is different. It's complicated. I'm already at the firm, I know the systems. It just makes sense." "Perhaps," I said, my voice soft but unyielding. "But for tonight, I just want to be alone. I need to feel him here one last time." You understand. He couldn't argue with that. It was the perfect, unassailable logic of a grieving widow. He looked like he wanted to protest, to insist on staying, but he finally relented with a sigh. All right, Mom. If you're sure. Call me if you need anything. Anything at all. I'll lock the door on my way out. I listened to his footsteps retreat, the solid click of the deadbolt sliding into place. The sound didn't make me feel safe. It made me feel trapped. For a long moment, I stood in the center of the living room, the house settling around me. The ghost of Richard was here, but it wasn't a comforting presence. It was the ghost of a stranger. Taking a deep breath, I walked not to our bedroom, but to his study. The door creaked open onto Richard's private world. The scent of old leather and paper, with the faint, phantom smell of the pipe tobacco he'd given up 10 years ago. Everything was in its place. The mahogany desk was clear except for a neat stack of mail. The leather-bound books stood in perfect rows on the shelves. It was the portrait of an orderly man with an orderly mind. A man with no secrets. A lie. I went to his filing cabinet first. Richard was meticulous. Everything was labeled, alphabetized, cross-referenced. I pulled open the drawer marked Personal Finances. The folders were all there, taxes, mortgage, investments. But at the very back, there was a gap. A space where 3 thick folders should have been. The hanging files were still there, their plastic tabs empty. I ran my finger along the edge of the adjacent folder. The label read, Cayman Accounts. The next one was Zurich Holdings. The space between them was a gaping wound. My heart began to beat a little faster. It was a frantic, bird-like flutter against my ribs. Next, the computer. I sat in his imposing leather chair, the seat still holding the faint impression of his body. I pressed the power button. The screen hummed to life, displaying not the familiar desktop cluttered with icons, but a stark, clean setup screen. The kind you see on a brand new machine. Welcome. Please select your language. My blood ran cold. The hard drive had been wiped. Not just deleted. Wiped clean, professionally. This wasn't the work of a panicking amateur. This was a deliberate, calculated erasure of every file, every email, every trace of Richard's digital life. I pushed back from the desk, a wave of nausea rolling over me. My eyes scanned the room, searching for something, anything, that felt true. My gaze landed on the bookshelf, on a specific set of encyclopedias. Volume 4. When Leo was a boy, he'd accidentally broken the spine. Richard had repaired it himself, with glue and patience. It always sat just a little crooked. Behind that book was our secret. A small, hollowed-out space in the wall where we kept things of sentimental value. The first love letters we'd written, a lock of Leo's baby hair, the cork from a bottle of champagne we'd shared on our 25th anniversary. Richard called it our time capsule. My hands trembled as I pulled the book from the shelf. I reached into the dark cavity behind it, my fingers expecting to touch the familiar velvet pouch that held our treasures. My fingers met nothing but cold, rough plaster. The space was empty. I sank back into the chair, the room spinning slightly. This was the blow that struck deepest. The financial files, the computer, that was business. That was the world of Richard Vance, the consultant. But this was our life. Our history. Someone had come into this sacred room and not only stolen his secrets, but had also stolen ours. And there were only 2 people on this earth besides Richard who knew about that hiding place. Me. And the son who had just locked me in this house full of ghosts. The night stretched on, an endless expanse of shadows and silence. I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat in Richard's armchair, the soft leather cool against my skin, and let the questions cascade through my mind. Each one was a stone, and I was at the bottom of a well they were being dropped into. Who was in the casket? Why would Richard fake his death? What did Leo know? By the time the first watery gray light of dawn seeped through the windows, I had reached a cold, hard conclusion. Grief was a luxury I could no longer afford. I was not a widow. I was a woman whose husband had vanished, and whose son was a liar. My world had not just been turned upside down, it had been revealed as a lie from the very foundation. I made coffee, the familiar ritual, a small anchor in the churning sea of my thoughts. The strong, bitter aroma helped clear the fog from my brain. I needed a plan. Direct confrontation was Leo's territory. He could dissemble, feign hurt, turn my accusations back on me with a wounded look. I needed facts. I needed leverage. Leo arrived around 9, bearing a bag of fresh bagels and a container of cream cheese. The dutiful son, checking on his grieving mother. His face was etched with a convincing weariness. "Morning, Mom," he said, forcing a smile. "You sleep at all?" "As well as can be expected," I replied, my voice perfectly even. I poured him a mug of coffee. We sat at the small kitchen table, the silence thick with unspoken things. This was the same table where I'd helped him with his homework, where we'd carved pumpkins and decorated Christmas cookies. Now it felt like an interrogation room. I decided to start small, to test the first crack. "Leo," I began, stirring my coffee, my eyes fixed on the swirl of cream. "I was thinking about your speech yesterday. It was beautiful. But you seemed distressed." He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his shoulders. "I was giving a eulogy for my father, Mom." Of course I was distressed. "No, it was more than that," I pressed gently, finally looking up to meet his gaze. "Right in the middle of it, you stopped. You looked so frightened." "It was when you looked at me." His eyes darted away from mine, toward the window. The grief just hit me all at once. It was overwhelming, standing up there. Seeing you alone in the front row. His voice was smooth, the explanation plausible. Too plausible. It was a pre-packaged answer, ready to be unwrapped. I let it go, for now. I buttered a bagel, my movements slow and deliberate. "I suppose I've just been thinking about his last day. Trying to piece it all together in my mind. It helps, somehow." "There's not much to piece together," he said quickly, a little too quickly. He went to the office in the morning, same as always. Then he called me around noon, said the sea was calling and he was heading out to the marina. That was the last time anyone spoke to him. He had told me this story before. He had told the police this story. I had believed him. He seemed normal? Nothing troubling him? No, he was fine. Eager to get out on the water. You know how he was. Yes, I knew how he was. Meticulous. A planner. He never did anything on a whim. I took a bite of my bagel, chewing thoughtfully. I let the silence hang for a moment before I delivered the strike. "That's the strange thing," I said, dabbing my lips with a napkin. I was sorting through the clothes from his dry cleaning yesterday. The suit he wore last week. I paused. I found a receipt in his jacket pocket. I watched him. His jaw was tight, but his expression was carefully neutral. He was waiting. "It was from the clam shack over in Portland," I continued, my voice a soft murmur. "It was a lunch receipt. For two. And it was dated for the day he disappeared. Time-stamped at 1:30 p.m. Leo froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. Portland was a good hour's drive from the marina in Kennebunkport, in the opposite direction from his office. I let the implication hang in the air between us. If Richard was having lunch in Portland at 1:30, he couldn't have been heading to his boat at noon. Leo set his cup down with a clatter. "Well, that's odd. He must have gone there first. Maybe he met with a client." "Who?" I asked simply. "I don't know, Mom, I don't handle all his client meetings." It could have been anyone. The smooth facade was beginning to crumble, revealing the frantic irritation beneath. The receipt was for 2 lobster rolls and 2 beers, I said, my voice as cold and calm as the Atlantic in winter. Your father hadn't drunk beer in 20 years. Not since his doctor told him to watch his cholesterol. The color drained from Leo's face. He knew he was caught. I had him. It wasn't a confession, not yet. But it was the first undeniable proof of his deceit. It was a hairline fracture in the dam of his lies, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that if I pressed hard enough, the whole thing would come crashing down. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back slightly. Look, I don't know what you're getting at. Maybe you misread the date. Maybe Dad just bought lunch for someone else. You're grieving. You're not thinking clearly. He was turning it back on me, just as I'd predicted. The concerned son, worried about his poor, confused, widowed mother. But I wasn't confused. For the first time since the funeral, my mind was crystal clear. You're right, Leo, I said, standing to clear our plates. I didn't look at him. I'm probably just tired. Making things up. My agreement seemed to soothe him. He visibly relaxed. As I carried the dishes to the sink, I added, almost as an afterthought, by the way, I was looking for that old photo album in your father's study, the one with the broken spine. I couldn't seem to find it. You haven't seen it, have you? I heard his sharp intake of breath behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know what I would see on his face. Pure, unadulterated guilt. No, he said, his voice strained. No, I haven't seen it. He made his excuses a few minutes later, saying he had to get to the office to start sorting things out. I walked him to the door, a serene smile on my face. You work too hard, dear, I said, placing a hand on his arm. His muscles were tense as steel cables. As I watched him hurry to his car, I knew 2 things for certain. My son was lying to protect a secret. And I was going to find out what it was, no matter what it cost me. The battle had begun. For 2 days, I lived in a house that had become a foreign country. I moved through the familiar rooms, touching the objects that had defined my life, the worn armchair where Richard read the paper, the collection of porcelain birds on the mantelpiece, the faded photograph of a young, smiling Leo on the beach. Everything was the same, and yet, nothing was. The objects were props on a stage, and I was an actress who had forgotten her lines because the play had changed without her knowledge. Leo called twice a day, his voice a strange mix of concern and surveillance. How are you feeling, Mom? Are you eating? Do you need me to come over? I kept my answers brief and placid, the perfect image of a woman lost in her sorrow. But in the quiet hours, my mind was a whirlwind of activity. I was a historian by training, and I was now faced with the most critical research project of my life, the excavation of my own marriage. I knew I couldn't do it alone. Leo was a wall I couldn't break through with questions. The police believed the story of a tragic accident. The empty file folders and the wiped computer were dead ends. I needed someone who knew how to look beneath the surface, someone who understood the dark currents that ran beneath the placid veneer of our town. I needed someone Richard had trusted, and then, for some reason, had pushed away. My mind settled on a name I hadn't spoken in years, David Miller. David had been Richard's closest friend once. They had grown up together, 2 rough-and-tumble boys who knew every cove and back road of this coast. David had become a detective with the state police, Richard, a master of finance. For decades, they were inseparable. Then, about 5 years ago, it had just stopped. There was no dramatic falling out, just a slow, deliberate cooling. When I'd asked Richard about it, he'd been uncharacteristically evasive. We just grew apart, Eleanor. It happens. Now, I suspected it hadn't just happened. Richard had engineered it. Finding David wasn't hard. He had retired a few years back and was listed in the phone book. I called him from a payphone at the public library, a relic of a bygone era that suddenly felt like a vital tool for espionage. The paranoia was new to me, and it fit like an ill-fitting coat, but I wore it nonetheless. His voice was exactly as I remembered it, gravelly, laced with the cynicism of a man who had seen too much. He sounded surprised to hear from me, but agreed to meet. "Not at your house," he'd said immediately. "Too many eyes. The diner on Route 1. An hour." The diner was a classic slice of Americana, all chrome and cracked red vinyl. The air smelled of stale coffee and bacon grease. David was already there, tucked into a corner booth. He looked older than I remembered, his face a road map of worry lines, but his eyes were the same, sharp, intelligent, and missing nothing. He stood when I approached, a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy. "Eleanor," he said, his voice softer in person. "I'm so sorry for your loss." "Thank you for coming, David," I said, sliding into the booth. A waitress appeared, and we ordered coffee. We engaged in the necessary pleasantries, the careful dance of condolences and reminiscences. But the whole time, I could feel him studying me, his detective's gaze assessing, analyzing. Finally, he leaned forward slightly. "You didn't call me for coffee and sympathy, Eleanor. What's going on?" I took a deep breath. For the first time, I was about to give voice to the madness that had consumed my life. I slid my phone across the table, the screen open to the text message. He picked it up, his brow furrowing as he read. He read it twice, then a third time. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "A cruel prank," he said, but it wasn't a statement. It was a question. "Look at the time it was sent," I said quietly. "It was during Leo's eulogy." "And then look at the initial." He fell silent, his thumb tracing the edges of the phone. I told him everything. The fear in Leo's eyes. The missing files. The wiped computer. The empty hiding place. The receipt from the clam shack. I laid out the facts like a prosecutor making a case, my voice low and steady, betraying none of the terror that was churning inside me. When I finished, he just stared into his coffee cup for a long time. The diner hummed around us, a pocket of ordinary life in my extraordinary new world. "You always were the smart one, Eleanor," he said at last, not looking at me. "Richard used to say you were the only person who could beat him at chess." "He let me win," I murmured. "No, he didn't," David said, finally meeting my eyes. His were filled with a grim seriousness. "I haven't spoken to your husband in 5 years, not since he told me to mind my own damn business. But I can tell you this. If Richard Vance faked his own death, it's because he was running from something much, much worse than drowning. And you, whether you like it or not, are standing in the middle of the blast radius." He slid my phone back across the table. "Who knew about the hiding place behind the book?" "Only Richard, me, and Leo." "Then your son is either involved, or he's being used as a pawn by someone who is." He took a long swallow of his coffee. "The body they found, it was in bad shape. Saltwater does that. Identification was made from dental records provided by his dentist. It's a solid ID. But it could be faked?" I pressed. "Anything can be faked if you have enough money or enough leverage." He sighed, a heavy, weary sound. "I'm retired, Eleanor. I don't have access to the resources I once did. But I still have friends. I can make some calls, unofficially. Check the financials, the autopsy report, see if any flags were raised on Richard's disappearance. But you need to be careful. You go home, you play the grieving widow. You watch your son. And you don't trust anyone. Not the mailman, not your friendly neighbor, no one. The man I knew as Richard Vance was capable of building an empire. A man like that is also capable of making enemies who don't forget." He reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn business card with only a phone number scrawled on it. "This is a burner phone. Memorize the number, then destroy the card. Call me only from a payphone. If you notice anything out of the ordinary, anything, you call me. Understand?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. As I walked back to my car, the gray sky finally broke, and a cold, miserable rain began to fall. It matched the chill that had settled deep in my bones. David's warning echoed in my ears. I was in a blast radius. And the bomb had already gone off. I just hadn't realized it yet. I was no longer just searching for my husband. I was trying to survive him. The act of playing the grieving widow was exhausting. It required a constant, low-level hum of performance. I had to remember to let my shoulders slump, to allow a tremor in my hand as I poured my tea, to let my eyes drift to a photograph of Richard with a convincing air of wistful sorrow. My neighbor, Maggie, a kind woman with a penchant for gossip and home-baked pies, was a frequent visitor. Each knock on the door sent a jolt of adrenaline through me, and I had to compose my features into a mask of gentle sadness before opening it. "Oh, you poor dear," she'd say, bustling in with a still warm apple crisp. "You're just wasting away. You have to eat." I would thank her, offer her coffee, and listen to her chatter about the church bake sale and the scandalous affair the new postman was having. I searched her kind, vacuous face for any flicker of guile, any sign that she was more than she seemed. David's warning had made me a stranger in my own life, viewing everyone through a lens of suspicion. It was 3 days after my meeting with David that the man arrived. I was in the living room, ostensibly sorting through old photo albums, but really just staring out the window at the rain-slicked street. A modest, dark gray sedan, a Ford Taurus perhaps, pulled up to the curb. It was the kind of car that was utterly forgettable, designed to blend in. A man got out. He was as forgettable as his car. Medium height, medium build, dressed in a drab suit that looked a size too big. He carried a worn leather briefcase. He walked up my path and rang the doorbell. My heart gave a painful lurch. I took a moment to compose myself, then opened the door. "Mrs. Vance?" he asked. His voice was as colorless as his suit. "Yes. My name is Julian Croft. I'm from North Atlantic Mutual. Your husband's life insurance provider." He held out a business card. "I'm very sorry for your loss. May I come in for a few moments? There are some forms that require your signature to begin processing the claim." Everything about him seemed legitimate, yet a primal alarm bell was screaming in the back of my mind. He was too placid, too controlled. His eyes, a pale, watery blue, seemed to take in everything, the layout of the hall, the staircase, the open door to Richard's study, without seeming to move at all. "Of course," I said, stepping back to let him in. "Keep playing the part, Eleanor." We sat at the dining room table. He opened his briefcase and laid out a series of documents, their pages filled with the dense, unreadable language of insurance policies. He explained them in a patient, almost soothing monotone. "Standard procedure, Mrs. Vance. We just need to confirm a few details." His questions began innocuously. He asked about the date and time Richard had left the house, the state of his health, the condition of the boat. I gave him the official version of the story, the same one Leo had told, the one I now knew was a lie. Then the questions shifted, subtly, like a river changing its course. "Your husband was a very successful man," Croft said, tapping a pen on the folder. "Did he have any significant business pressures recently? Any deals that had gone sour?" "Not that he mentioned to me," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I didn't involve myself much in his work." "Of course," he murmured. His pale eyes met mine. "And in his personal life? Any unresolved conflicts? Any old friends or associates he may have had a falling out with?" The question was a dart, aimed with precision. He was fishing, but for what? "My husband was a well-respected man, Mr. Croft. He didn't have enemies." The lie tasted like ash in my mouth. "I see." He made a small note on a pad. "And were there any large, recent withdrawals from your joint accounts? Any financial movements that were out of the ordinary?" This was not the question of a simple insurance agent. This was an interrogation. He wasn't here to give me money, he was here to find money. I haven't had the strength to look at our finances yet, I said, letting a convincing wave of weariness wash over my features. My son, Leo, is handling all of that. At the mention of Leo's name, I saw the barest flicker of interest in his eyes. He knew about Leo. Yes, your son, Croft said smoothly. He's a partner at the firm, I believe. He must have had a clear picture of his father's business dealings. He packed up his briefcase a few minutes later, the forms signed, his questions left hanging in the air like dust motes. I walked him to the door. We'll be in touch as soon as the claim is processed, Mrs. Vance, he said, giving me a thin, bloodless smile. As he walked back to his car, I stayed in the doorway, watching. He didn't get in immediately. He stood by the driver's side door, his back to me, and spoke into his phone. I was too far away to hear the words, but his posture was tense, coiled. He wasn't a claims adjuster. He was a hunter. I closed the door, my hand trembling as I slid the deadbolt home. A cold dread, far deeper than grief, seeped into my bones. The world Richard had built, the one I had lived in so comfortably for 50 years, had a dark, hidden basement. And Julian Croft had just shown me the door. Later that evening, as dusk bled into night, I was washing the dinner dishes when a flicker of movement outside the kitchen window caught my eye. I looked up. The street was empty, lamps casting pools of lonely yellow light on the wet pavement. I dismissed it as a trick of the light, a branch swaying in the wind. But then I saw it again. The same gray sedan that Croft had driven was parked 2 houses down, almost completely hidden in the shadows of a large oak tree. The windows were tinted, but I could feel it, a palpable sense of being watched. They weren't even trying to be subtle. It was a message. We are here. We are waiting. I quickly turned off the kitchen light, my heart hammering against my ribs. I moved through the darkened house to the living room window, peeking through a slit in the curtains. The car was still there, a silent, menacing predator in the quiet suburban night. They weren't watching for Richard. They knew he was gone. They were watching me. Because they believed I knew where he, or more likely, his money, had gone. The pane of glass that had once separated me from the world was gone, and now there was nothing between me and the shadows at my window. The gray sedan became a fixture on my street, a constant, silent sentinel. Sometimes it was parked by the oak tree, sometimes across the street, always in a position with a clear view of my front door. The presence of Julian Croft, or whoever he worked for, was a low, persistent hum of terror beneath the surface of my days. I felt like a specimen under a microscope, every trip to the grocery store, every phone call, a potential clue to be analyzed by unseen eyes. Sleep became a distant memory. I would lie in the vast emptiness of the bed I had shared with Richard and listen to the house groan and settle, imagining footsteps on the stairs, the whisper of the lock being picked. Was this the fear my husband had lived with in his final months? Was this what had driven him to erase himself from the world? 2 days after Croft's visit, I drove to the next town over and found a payphone outside a laundromat. The smell of bleach and damp clothes hung in the air as I dialed the number David Miller had given me. He answered on the second ring. "Talk to me, Eleanor." "He came to the house," I said, my voice low, turning my back to the street. "A man named Julian Croft. He said he was from the insurance company." I described Croft, his forgettable appearance, his pointed questions, the way his eyes seemed to catalog everything. I told him about the gray sedan. David was silent for a moment. When he spoke, the usual cynicism in his voice had been replaced by a hard, sharp edge of urgency. "Eleanor, North Atlantic Mutual has no agent named Julian Croft." I checked. "Whoever this man is, he's not who he says he is. You need to be incredibly careful." He was asking about money, David. About business deals gone wrong. "Of course he was," David said grimly. "I've been digging, Eleanor." Quietly. It wasn't easy. Richard was a master at burying things, creating shell corporations within shell corporations. It's like a set of Russian nesting dolls. But I found the last one. The smallest one. He paused. I could hear the faint sound of him lighting a cigarette. About 3 years ago, Richard took on a new client. A big one. An investment firm out of Boston called Apex Holdings. Except Apex Holdings isn't a real firm. It's a front. A money laundering operation for some very nasty people. The kind of people who don't write strongly worded letters when they're displeased. The laundromat's spinning machines blurred before my eyes. My hand tightened on the cold metal of the receiver. Richard was washing money? I don't know if he knew what he was getting into at first. Maybe he thought it was just a client with a flexible attitude towards taxes. But he was in deep, Eleanor. And from what I can piece together, a lot of their money went missing right around the time Richard did. We're talking millions. A hole in their books big enough to notice. Millions. The word was obscene. Richard and I had lived comfortably, but not lavishly. We had a nice house, took a modest vacation once a year. The idea that he was swimming in a sea of illicit cash was unthinkable. So they think Richard took it, I breathed. And now they think I know where it is. That would be my guess, David confirmed. Croft's visit wasn't an investigation, it was a warning. The car outside your house is the follow-up. My mind raced, connecting the dots. Richard hadn't faked his death to escape the law. He'd faked it to escape them. It wasn't a crime he was running from, it was a death sentence. Then David's voice dropped even lower. There's something else, Eleanor. Something that concerns Leo. My blood ran cold. What is it? Your son has a problem. A big one. I checked with a contact I have in Atlantic City. Leo's been placing bets way over his head. Sports betting, online poker, he's into the sharks for a lot of money. We're talking 6 figures. I sagged against the glass of the phone booth, the world tilting on its axis. Leo? My quiet, unassuming Leo, a gambler? It didn't make sense. And yet, it explained so much. His nervousness. His desperation to control the finances. And here's the kicker, David said, his voice grim. Just before Richard disappeared, there was a wire transfer. $250,000. It went from one of Richard's corporate accounts to an anonymous offshore account. A day later, Leo's debts in Atlantic City were paid off. In full. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening finality. The crack in the dam of Leo's lies became a catastrophic breach. He hadn't just lied to me, he had stolen from his own father. $250,000. He had stolen from the kind of men who would kill for a fraction of that amount. Oh, God, I whispered. Leo put you both in the crosshairs, Eleanor, David said, his voice devoid of pity. Richard was running from these people, and your son effectively stole from them, leading them right to your doorstep. You need to talk to him. You need to find out what he knows. Because Croft and his friends aren't going to just go away. I hung up the phone, my mind numb. I drove home on autopilot, the familiar roads twisting into a hostile landscape. The gray sedan was still there, a silent promise of violence. I found Leo in Richard's study. The door was ajar, and I saw him hunched over the desk, frantically sifting through a stack of bank statements. He looked hunted, his face pale and slick with sweat. He didn't hear me enter. I stood in the doorway and watched my son, my only child. And for the first time, I looked at him not as a mother, but as a stranger. I saw a weak man, a desperate man. A thief. Looking for something, Leo? I asked. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a shard of glass. He jumped, scattering the papers across the desk. Mom. You scared me. Did I? I walked slowly into the room, closing the door behind me. I think you've been scared for a while now. Tell me about Atlantic City, Leo. Tell me about the $250,000. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The lies were gone. There was nothing left to hide behind. He looked at me, his eyes wide with the terror of a child caught in an unforgivable act. And then, my son, my 45-year-old son, crumpled into his father's chair and began to sob. The sound of Leo's weeping was a raw, ugly thing in the quiet study. It wasn't the dignified grief of a man mourning his father, it was the desperate, gut-wrenching sound of a cornered animal. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with convulsive sobs. The bank statements lay scattered around him like fallen leaves. I did not move to comfort him. The maternal instinct that had defined my life for 45 years was frozen, locked away behind a wall of ice. I stood by the door, my arms crossed, and waited. The silence stretched, broken only by his ragged breaths. Finally, he looked up, his face blotchy and swollen, his eyes pleading. Mom, I didn't know what to do. I was drowning. Start from the beginning, I said. My voice was devoid of warmth, the voice of a judge demanding testimony. And so, the story tumbled out, a torrent of weakness and bad decisions. It had started small, he said. A few friendly bets on football games. Then it was poker, the thrill of the win, the intoxicating rush. But the wins became losses, and the losses grew. He'd chased them, convinced the next hand, the next game, would be the one to make it right. He'd borrowed from friends, then from credit cards, and finally, when those ran out, from a loan shark with connections to the kind of people David had described. They were going to hurt me, Mom, he whispered, his voice cracking. They sent a man to my apartment. He didn't even say anything. He just sat in my living room for an hour, polishing a pair of brass knuckles. He said he'd be back. Fear, pure and primal, had driven him to the one place he knew there was money. His father's business. He had a partner's access codes. He knew the accounts. He found one, a holding company he didn't recognize, with a large, fluid balance. He told himself he was just borrowing it. He would win big, pay it back, and no one would ever know. I took it, he said, shame coloring his voice. $250,000. I wired it out. I paid them off. I felt relief. For about a day. And then Father found out, I stated. It wasn't a question. Leo nodded miserably. He called me. His voice. I'd never heard it like that. It was dead. Cold. He just said, the marina. 1 hour. We need to talk. Leo described the scene on the docks, the sky bruised with the colors of an approaching storm, the wind whipping off the Atlantic. Richard had been waiting for him, his face carved from granite. He hadn't yelled. That would have been easier. Instead, he had spoken in a low, terrifying voice, explaining with clinical precision what Leo had done. He said, that wasn't my money, you fool. That money belonged to them. You didn't just steal from me. You painted a target on this entire family. Richard had explained everything then. Apex Holdings. The money laundering. The threats that had kept him a prisoner for years. He'd been planning his escape, a meticulous, desperate gamble to disappear and save them all. Leo's theft had been a grenade tossed into the middle of his fragile plan. He told me he was going to the police, Leo choked out. He said turning me in was the only way to prove to them that the family wasn't involved in the theft. That it was just one rogue idiot's son. He said it might buy you some protection. He was going to sacrifice me to save you. The image was stark, brutal. Richard, ready to feed his own son to the wolves to save his wife. It was a love of a terrible, pragmatic kind. I begged him, Mum, Leo cried, tears streaming down his face again. I got on my knees on the dock. I told him I'd do anything. I pleaded with him. But he just looked at me like he didn't know me. He said, "My son is dead." Then he got on the boat. He untied the ropes and started the engine. He looked back at me one last time and shouted over the wind, "I hope it was worth it." And he just sailed out into the storm. Leo's story was horrifying. It was pathetic. And I believed every word of it. His fear, his shame, they were too real to be faked. But there was a hollowness to the end of it, a missing piece. "And you just let him go?" I asked, my voice sharp. "You let him sail into a storm, knowing he was going to ruin your life?" He wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at his hands, twisting them in his lap. I was terrified. I just stood there. I watched the boat get smaller and smaller until the rain started and I couldn't see it anymore. I swear, Mom. That was the last I saw of him. He was telling the truth, but it wasn't the whole truth. There was a subtle evasion in his gaze, a slight shift in his posture. He was holding something back. The final, critical piece of the puzzle. But I knew I couldn't push him for it now. He was too fragile, his confession having drained him of all fortitude. "And the text message?" I asked, my voice softening slightly. "Did you know he was alive?" He shook his head vehemently. "No. I swear. When you got that, I thought I was going to have a heart attack right there in the church. I thought he'd come back. That he was going to expose me. Or that maybe they had found him. That it was a trick." His fear was genuine. He didn't know if his father was a ghost or a threat, and he was terrified of both possibilities. He was a child who had broken his father's most prized possession and was now living in dread of the punishment. I looked at my son, this broken man in a dead man's chair, and the ice around my heart began to crack. He was weak, yes. A fool. A thief. But he was my son. And Richard's plan, his terrible, calculated plan to sacrifice Leo, had been derailed. Richard was gone, alive or dead, he was gone, and the wolves he had been running from were no longer chasing him. They were here. At my door. And my foolish, terrified son and I were all that stood in their way. The days following Leo's confession were a strange, suspended purgatory. We were prisoners in a house that was no longer a home. The gray sedan remained, a permanent feature of the landscape, as mundane and as menacing as a spider in a corner. Leo was a ghost, haunting the edges of rooms, his face a constant mask of shame and fear. The air between us was thick with the things we couldn't say. He had confessed his crime, but I had not offered forgiveness. There was no room for it yet. We were allies of circumstance, bound not by love, but by a shared and imminent danger. I spent my time watching, thinking. I was a historian, trained to see patterns in chaos, to understand the motivations behind the great, sweeping movements of history. Now, I applied that skill to the tiny, claustrophobic war zone of my own life. Richard, the brilliant strategist. Leo, the fatal flaw in the plan. Julian Croft, the patient predator. And me, the unknown variable. The quiet queen on the chessboard, overlooked until the final moves of the game. On the 5th day of our siege, the doorbell rang. It was not the gentle chime of Maggie the neighbor. It was a sharp, insistent buzz that cut through the silence like a drill. Leo, who had been staring blankly at the television, jumped as if he'd been shot. We looked at each other, the same thought in our eyes, they're here. They're done waiting. I put a finger to my lips, signaling for him to be silent. I crept to the living room window, peering through the edge of the curtain. It wasn't Croft. It was a courier in a crisp brown uniform, holding a small cardboard box and a digital scanner. He looked impatient. My mind raced. A delivery? I hadn't ordered anything. Was it a trap? A bomb? The paranoia felt both absurd and entirely rational. Stay here, I whispered to Leo. I walked to the door, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I opened it just a crack, leaving the security chain in place. Eleanor Vance, the courier asked, chewing his gum loudly. Yes. Package for you. Need a signature. He held the scanner out through the gap. My hand trembled as I scrawled a shaky line on the screen. He pushed the box through and turned to leave without another word. I bolted the door and carried the small, deceptively light package into the kitchen as if it were a venomous snake. Leo hovered behind me. What is it? Who's it from? He whispered. There's no return address, I said, turning it over in my hands. The postmark was from a town in New Hampshire I'd never heard of. It was addressed to me, in neat, block letters printed by a machine. Using a kitchen knife, I carefully sliced through the packing tape. Inside, nestled in a bed of shredded paper, was a single object. A book. It was an old, well-worn paperback edition of Sun Tzu's The Art of War. A wave of memory, so sharp it was physically painful, washed over me. Richard had given it to me on our 10th anniversary. I had wanted jewelry, he had given me a book on military strategy. To win without fighting is best, Eleanor, he'd said with a smile. You've always known that. You're the shrewdest tactician I know. I had thought it was a strange, unromantic gift at the time. Now, I understood. It wasn't a gift. It was a lesson. My fingers, now steady, traced the familiar creased cover. I opened it. Tucked between the pages on the use of spies, 2 items fell out onto the table. One was a small, thin piece of plastic, the size of a credit card but without any markings except for a metallic strip on the back. A key card. The other was a small slip of paper, folded once. On it, in Richard's familiar, precise handwriting, was a single word. Cicada. Leo stared at it, confused. Cicada? What does that mean? But I knew. The memory rose, clear and perfect, from a summer evening years ago. We had been sitting on the porch, listening to the deafening, electric thrum of the cicadas in the trees. Remarkable creatures, Richard had mused, swirling the scotch in his glass. They live underground for 17 years. In the dark. Silent. Everyone forgets they're even there. And then, when the time is right, they emerge. Stronger, louder than anything else in the forest. They fulfill their purpose, and then they're gone again. It's the perfect disappearing act. The perfect rebirth. It was a code. A message only I could understand. Richard hadn't just run. He had gone underground, like a cicada. He was waiting. And he had left me a way to find what he had buried. It's a key, I said, my voice filled with a certainty that startled even me. And a password. The fear that had been my constant companion for days did not vanish, but it shifted. It made way for something else, something cold and hard and clear. Purpose. Richard hadn't abandoned me to the wolves. He had left me a map. He had left me a weapon. He had trusted me, his shrewdest tactician, to know how to use them. I looked from the key card to the book, its title a silent command. The Art of War. The lessons were all there: know your enemy, know yourself, turn weakness into strength. Julian Croft and his employers thought I was a helpless old woman, a pawn to be intimidated. They were about to find out how wrong they were. I picked up the key card. He left us a way out, Leo. My son looked at me, his eyes wide. He saw the change in me. The fragile, grieving widow was gone. In her place stood someone he didn't recognize. What are we going to do? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. I met his gaze, my own clear and steady. We're going to dig. The key card felt impossibly heavy in my palm, a small rectangle of plastic that held the weight of our future. A bank. It had to be a bank. A safe deposit box, anonymous and secure. Richard was a man who believed in physical assets, intangible things you could hold in your hand. He wouldn't have trusted a purely digital trail. The challenge was figuring out which bank. There were dozens within a 50-mile radius. Visiting each one, asking if they had a box under a false name that could be opened with an unmarked key card, was not only impossible but would also raise alarms. The clue had to be in the word. Cicada. I spent the next hour in Richard's study, not looking for what was missing, but for what remained. I searched his books, his old calendars, his desk blotter. I was looking for a connection, however faint. And then I found it. Tucked inside a day planner from 3 years ago, on the date of our wedding anniversary, was a brochure. It was for a small, private financial institution I'd never heard of, Kennebunkport Secure Trust. It wasn't a commercial bank, it was the kind of discreet place that catered to the very wealthy, offering private vaults and anonymous services. On the front of the brochure, beneath the bank's name, was their corporate logo. It was a stylized, Art Deco representation of an insect. A cicada. "I've found it," I said to Leo, who was pacing a trench in the living room carpet. The drive to Kennebunkport Secure Trust was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Leo drove, his hands clenched on the wheel, his eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror. The gray sedan did not follow. They were content to watch the house. They didn't know the Queen had left the castle. The bank was an imposing granite building that looked more like a fortress than a financial institution. Inside, the air was cool and silent, the floors marble, the staff speaking in hushed, reverent tones. I approached a severe-looking woman behind a polished mahogany desk. "I am here to access a private box," I said, my voice betraying none of the tremor I felt inside. I placed the key card on the desk. She examined it without expression, then looked at me. "We will also require the verbal password." I took a breath. "Cicada." Her expression didn't change, but she gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She led us through a massive, gleaming steel door into the vault. The air grew colder. The only sound was the whisper of the ventilation and the soft click of her heels on the floor. She stopped before a wall of burnished brass boxes and used her own key, in conjunction with mine, to open a slender drawer at eye level. She slid out the long metal box, placed it on a nearby table in a private viewing room, and left, closing the door softly behind her. Leo and I stared at the box. It was the final secret, the heart of the labyrinth. I lifted the lid. Inside, there was no cash. No gold bars. No jewels. There was only a sleek, silver laptop and a single, sealed envelope with my name, Eleanor, written on it. My hands shook as I picked up the letter. I broke the seal. The letter was several pages long, written in Richard's hand. "My dearest Eleanor," it began. "If you are reading this, then I have succeeded, and I have failed. I have succeeded in escaping. But I have failed you, failed our life, in a way that I can never fully express my shame for. Forgive me." He told me everything, the unvarnished, brutal truth that he had hinted at to Leo. He explained how Apex Holdings had approached him, how they had seduced him with promises of unparalleled returns, how he had been blinded by greed and ego. By the time he realized he was laundering money for a violent criminal syndicate, it was too late. They had him. They made a veiled threat against Leo, a casual mention of his college campus, and Richard knew he was trapped. They owned me, Eleanor. For 3 years, I have lived in a gilded cage, my every move watched. I smiled at cocktail parties and planned our vacations, all the while knowing that one misstep would mean our deaths. I couldn't tell you. To tell you would have been to put you in the cage with me. The faked death had been his only way out, a desperate, last-ditch plan months in the making. He'd found a cadaver, an unclaimed John Doe from a morgue in another state, and paid a corrupt dentist a fortune to alter the dental records. He had planned it all, right down to the timing of the storm. "The money in this account," he wrote, "is their money. The money I was supposed to be cleaning for them. I took it all. It's enough for you and Leo to disappear. To start new lives somewhere they will never find you. There are files on this laptop. Instructions, new identities, contacts who can help you. I beg you, take Leo and run. Don't look back. I read the last paragraph through a blur of tears, a mix of grief for the man I thought I knew and a terrible, aching pity for the man he had been forced to become. I don't know that you will ever be able to forgive me for the lies. I only know that every decision, even the most monstrous ones, I made to keep you safe. You were the only true thing in my life. I love you. Richard. I folded the letter, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. He hadn't known. He'd written this before Leo had stolen the money. His entire plan, his sacrifice, had been built on the premise that the money was safe, that it would be our salvation. But it wasn't. $250,000 of it was already gone, spent by our son. We didn't have enough to disappear. And worse, the theft had served as a homing beacon, leading the wolves right to our door. What is it, Mom? Leo asked, his voice strained. What does it say? I looked at him, at his pale, frightened face. It was his will, I said softly. His last will and testament. I opened the laptop. The screen glowed to life, a single folder on the desktop labeled Exodus. I clicked it open. It contained everything he'd promised, scanned passports with new names, bank account numbers in Switzerland, the deed to a small, isolated property in rural Oregon. It was a complete escape kit. A ghost of a life we could now never have. As I stared at the screen, a new folder I hadn't noticed before caught my eye. It was separate from the others, in the corner of the desktop. It was labeled with a single word. Insurance. I clicked it. It was password protected. My mind raced. What would he use? A birthday? An anniversary? Too simple. I thought of the book, The Art of War. I thought of his lesson. To win without fighting is best. I typed in the password, Sun Tzu. The folder opened. It contained dozens of files. Scanned documents. Bank transfers. Names. Dates. Audio recordings. It was everything. A complete and damning ledger of Apex Holdings' entire operation, implicating politicians, judges, and police officials. It was Richard's checkmate. His dead man's switch. The weapon he had never intended for me to have to use. But he had underestimated his son. And he had underestimated his wife. I closed the laptop. My tears were dry. The grief and the fear had burned away, leaving behind a core of cold, hard rage. Richard's plan had failed. It was time for mine. I turned to Leo, my voice quiet but ringing with the authority of a general on the eve of battle. We're going home, I said. The game has changed. We drove home in a silence charged with unspoken energy. I held the laptop case on my lap, its cool, metallic surface a conduit for the icy resolve flooding my veins. Leo kept glancing at me, his expression a mixture of fear and awe. The woman who had left the house that morning was not the same one who was returning. The grieving widow, the terrified mother, she had been shed like a cicada's shell. When we pulled into the driveway, the gray sedan was gone. The street was quiet, deceptively peaceful in the late afternoon sun. My first thought was a flicker of hope, had they given up? But I knew better. This was not an ending. It was a tactical repositioning. They were done watching. They were ready to act. Go inside, Leo, I said, my voice calm. Pack a small bag. Only the essentials. Do it now. He didn't question me. He scrambled out of the car and into the house. I followed more slowly, my eyes scanning the street, the windows of the neighboring houses, the shadows between the trees. The world was no longer a safe and familiar place, it was a chessboard, and I was just now beginning to see all the pieces. Inside, the house felt different, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I placed the laptop on the dining room table, the same table where Julian Croft had laid out his papers. It felt like a lifetime ago. I was pouring myself a glass of water when I heard it. Not a loud noise, but a soft, subtle click from the direction of the back door. The sound of a lock being professionally, quietly disengaged. My heart didn't leap with fear. Instead, a profound and chilling calm settled over me. They're here. I didn't move. I heard a soft footstep in the kitchen behind me. It would have been much simpler if you'd just answered my questions, Mrs. Vance. I turned slowly. Julian Croft was standing in the archway between the kitchen and the dining room. He was no longer the bland, forgettable insurance agent. He wore a quiet confidence like a well-tailored suit. His pale eyes were as cold and empty as a winter sky. He was not alone. A much larger, thicker man stood just behind his shoulder, a silent, brutalist sculpture of muscle. I don't recall having any answers to give you, Mr. Croft, I said, my voice steady. I took a slow sip of my water. Croft's lips curved into that thin, bloodless smile. Oh, I think you do now. We saw you go to the bank. A very discreet establishment. We know Richard was clever. He would have left his little nest egg for you. We're just here to collect it on behalf of our associates. From upstairs, there was a sudden thud, then a muffled cry. Leo. Don't worry about your son, Croft said, noticing my gaze flicker towards the stairs. My colleague is just ensuring he doesn't do anything foolish. Like he did with our $250,000. He took a step into the room. Now, where is it, Eleanor? The laptop. The account numbers. Let's not make this any more unpleasant than it has to be. This was the moment. The culmination of all the lies, the fear, the secrets. I looked at this bland, murderous man, and I felt nothing but a cold, burning contempt. Richard had run from him. Leo had crumbled before him. I would do neither. The money is gone, Mr. Croft, I said simply. His smile faltered. Don't play games with me, old woman. It's no game. I looked him directly in the eye, my gaze unblinking. Richard took your money, yes. But he didn't hide it for me. He sent it somewhere you'll never get it back. This was my first move. A lie, but a plausible one. Croft's eyes narrowed. He didn't believe me, not completely. You're lying. Am I? I gestured to the laptop on the table. That doesn't contain account numbers. It contains something far more valuable. Something Richard called his insurance policy. I watched his face. A flicker of uncertainty. He knew Richard. He knew how the man's mind worked. It's a comprehensive record, Mr. Croft. Of Apex Holdings. Of every transaction, every bribe, every name. Your name is in there, I imagine. As is your boss's. And his boss's. It's a lovely little family tree of filth, and Richard made a copy. I let that sink in. Before he disappeared, I continued, my voice dropping to an almost conversational tone. He set up a dead man's switch. A very clever one. The file you want is set to be delivered to a select list of journalists at the New York Times and to the FBI's Organized Crime Division. The delivery is triggered by one of two things, my death, or my failure to input a cancellation code every 12 hours. Croft was perfectly still. The big man behind him shifted his weight, his knuckles flexing. You're bluffing, Croft said, but his voice lacked conviction. Are you willing to bet your life on that? And the lives of your employers? I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table. The frail old woman was gone. The general was in command. Because here is my offer. It's very simple. You walk out of my house. You and your men disappear from my life, from my son's life, and you never, ever come back. You tell your bosses that Richard outsmarted you. That the money is gone, and the leverage is untouchable. You walk away with your lives, and I disable the dead man's switch. He stared at me, his mind clearly racing, weighing the odds, calculating the risk. He was a man used to holding all the cards, to controlling every situation through fear. I had just taken that control away from him. "And if I just take the laptop," he hissed. "If I kill you and your son right now?" "Then the files are sent within the hour," I said without blinking. "You might get away. But your bosses won't. Their entire world will burn to the ground. And they will find you, Mr. Croft, and they will hold you personally responsible. You know how they deal with failure." Checkmate. He knew I was right. I saw it in the tightening of the muscles around his jaw, the cold fury in his eyes warring with the cold logic of self-preservation. I had created a scenario where killing me was a worse outcome for him than letting me live. He held my gaze for a long, silent eternity. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting down the seconds of his decision. Finally, he gave a curt, vicious nod. "You're a clever woman, Mrs. Vance. Your husband taught you well." "My husband taught me nothing," I said, my voice like ice. "This, I learned on my own." He turned, and with a flick of his head, summoned the man from behind him. They walked out of my dining room without another word. A moment later, I heard the man who had gone upstairs coming down. He didn't look at me as he followed the others out the back door. I stood listening until I heard the faint sound of a car engine starting, and then fading into the distance. I walked on shaking legs to the bottom of the staircase. "Leo?" I called out. He appeared at the top, his face white, a dark bruise already forming on his cheek. He stared at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. I sank into a chair at the dining room table, the adrenaline finally leaving my body, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. I had faced the monster. And I had won. But the war wasn't over yet. In the aftermath of the confrontation, a strange, hollow silence descended upon the house. The immediate threat was gone, but its ghost lingered in the bruised air. Leo came downstairs, a small overnight bag in his hand, and stared at the empty space where Julian Croft had stood. He looked at me, at the laptop on the table, and for the first time, the perpetual fear in his eyes was replaced by something else, a dawning, difficult respect. "Are they gone?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "For now," I said. But I knew it wasn't enough. Croft was a pragmatist. He had retreated because the tactical situation was untenable. But his employers were not men who forgot or forgave. We couldn't stay here. The dead man's switch was a good bluff, but it was a temporary shield, not a permanent solution. The only true safety lay in vanishing. There was one last move to make. One final, loose thread to tie off. That night, I called David Miller from a payphone. I told him what had happened, omitting the details of the insurance file. I simply told him Croft had come, that I had convinced him the money was gone for good, and that he had left. "They won't stay gone forever, Eleanor," he warned. "I know," I said. "Which is why I need one last favor, David. Not for me. For Richard." The next day, under the guise of an estate lawyer, David Miller acted as an anonymous intermediary. The plan was terrifying in its audacity. I opened the laptop, accessed the Swiss accounts Richard had set up, and initiated a transfer. Not to us. Not to an untraceable account for our escape. I transferred half of the remaining money, nearly $2 million, to an account number I had been given by David. An account belonging to Julian Croft. It was the ultimate Sun Tzu maneuver. The bridge of gold for a fleeing enemy. It was a payment for our lives, a severance package for his silence. It gave him a reason to tell his employers the money was truly gone, because a significant portion of it would now be his. It turned him from our hunter into an unwilling accomplice in our disappearance. He would have to argue on our behalf, insist the trail was cold, because his own fortune now depended on it. The second half of the money was my move alone. My final word in the matter. Richard had stolen it from criminals. Leo had stolen it from Richard. The money was poisoned, tainted by greed and fear. To use it to fund our new life felt like building a house with rotten wood. Following instructions from another of David's discreet contacts, I transferred the remaining $2 million, anonymously, to a national fund for the victims of organized crime. Let the blood money wash away some of the blood. It was a quiet act of atonement, for Richard's sins and for my own. The accounts Richard had so carefully built were now empty. We were left with nothing but what we had before, the equity in our house and our own wits. It was enough. It felt clean. We sold the house within a week, for a fraction of its worth, to a cash buyer who asked no questions. We sold the furniture, the car, everything. We erased 50 years of our lives, packing what was left into 2 suitcases. Our last evening in the house was quiet. We ordered pizza and ate it on the floor of the empty living room, the echo of our voices strange in the cavernous space. The relationship between Leo and me was irrevocably changed. The parent-child dynamic was gone, replaced by a fragile partnership between 2 survivors. He had seen a side of me he never knew existed, and I had seen him at his absolute worst. There was a chasm between us, but on its edges, a tentative bridge of understanding was being built. He was, for the first time, treating me not as his mother, but as his equal. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, breaking a long silence. "For everything." "I know, Leo," I said. I didn't say I forgave him. It was too soon for that. Forgiveness was a sentiment for a world we no longer lived in. But there was acceptance. A weary, pragmatic acceptance of the new reality he had helped create. On our final morning, I woke before sunrise and went out onto the back porch. The air was cool and salty, carrying the scent of the ocean. I watched as the sky slowly brightened, from a deep indigo to a soft, bruised purple, then to a blaze of orange and pink over the dark, churning water. The same ocean that had been the stage for Richard's faked death, the symbol of his escape, now offered a different kind of promise. A vast, unknowable horizon. A new beginning. My phone, a cheap burner I'd bought for cash, vibrated in my pocket. A new message. Unknown number. My heart gave a familiar, painful lurch. It was just 5 words. "You were always the stronger one." Live. There was no initial. There didn't need to be. It was Richard. A final goodbye. A release. He was out there somewhere, a ghost in his own life, but he had seen, somehow he had known, what I had done. He was setting me free. My thumb hovered over the screen. I could have saved it. A last remnant of the man I had loved for 50 years. But that man, and that life, were gone. Saving the message would be like keeping a single stone from a house that had already burned to the ground. I pressed delete. The message vanished. I stood up, turning my back on the sunrise, and walked back into the empty house where Leo was waiting. I didn't know where we were going, not really. Oregon, perhaps. Or somewhere else entirely. It didn't matter. I was no longer Eleanor Vance, widow of Richard Vance. The roles that had defined me, wife, mother, quiet historian, were gone, stripped away by betrayal and fire. I was just Eleanor. And for the first time in a very long time, my story was my own.